Princess Dido was once named to be regent and co-heir over the city of Tyre when her father died. Both her and her brother, co-heirs, meant to rule together when the day came. However, upon her father's death, her mother, Queen Eliza, and the nobles of Tyre declared Pygmalion, Dido's brother, the sole heir, with Queen Eliza as the regent, since Pygmalion was only an infant at the time. Princess Dido, knowing that she was cheated from her throne, decided rather than to try and seek an immediate revenge, began a different kind of revenge. She welcomed her brother as the king and congratulated her mother on becoming regent, asking instead to serve as a privateer captain to earn gold for Phoenicia and to learn how to be a good leader and eventually a good wife to cement an alliance with one of the many powers of the Central Sea. Now, Queen Eliza knew that her daughter was plotting something, but the thought of a successful princess privateer meant more gold for her and more gold for the palace. The economies of the world back then meant that most of the wealth went to the palace, and the palace decided where the gold went, if they decided to spend it anywhere. But there was a lot of gold to make on the Central Sea. Trade was done often oversea, but pirates and privateers meant that wealth was often stolen or even sunken. So Queen Eliza knew that this could very well mean that either Princess Dido would bring more wealth to Tyre, reducing the other attacks from pirates and privateers, or at the very least, die trying, meaning that her son would rule without challenge, and leaving the queen's hands clean of blood. Princess Dido found herself as one of the most successful privateers in the history of the Central Sea Bronze Age. She was clever in her tactics and observations, oftentimes seeming to know what her enemies were going to do before they would do it. She was able to dodge ramming ships, remove boarders, and figure out where the pirates and privateers were hiding, some of whom had been hiding from Phoenicia for decades. Her focus, when dealing with the enemy, wasn't trying to destroy the ships, nor kill her enemies. Even ships with empty holds and starving crew were far more valuable intact than destroyed. She didn't spare the crews and ships of those she raided in a sense of morality, at least not a morality that you would likely consider in the modern day. Merchant ships with saffron, violet, linen, olive oil, salt, and gold were valuable holds, but intact ships were valuable too. The construction of a ship is costly. It can take anywhere from months to years and hundreds, if not thousands, of people to build one ship. Every component of a ship is valuable. Sails were so valuable that one king during the Bronze Age planned a great invasion with hundreds of ships, thousands of men, and millions of arms. Then all of the sails of his ships were stolen overnight. The cost of replacing all the sails cost more than the rest of his invasion, bankrupting the king and stopping the invasion. And those were just the plunder. The pillage helped Dido build her seafaring empire as well. Waterproof barrels meant beer, wine, or even water that could be carried over the sea without the effort of making new barrels. Ropes, pegs, nails, tools, and arms were also valuable when you were building your own fleet of loyal vessels. Every ship captured meant another ship that Princess Dido could use, and on those ships were the true treasures for Princess Dido and her plans. People are a resource. This axiom has been repeated, likely since before the Age of Myths, but Princess Dido understood this better, far better, than her mother or her brother. Most crews, pirate, merchant, and privateer, are all too eager to work for a brand new captain that pays better than the old captain. Honor and loyalty among thieves was usually as far as your sword arm. Honor and loyalty from merchants was usually as far as the next paycheck. This meant that many experienced sailors from many different nations, cities, and empires all found themselves united by Princess Dido's banner. This did not mean that Princess Dido didn't take prisoners. Ships often had passengers who weren't sailors, fishers, and marines. Sometimes they were merchants, nobles, or simply peasants who were going somewhere new. Prisoners that Princess Dido would make sure to take good physical care of. Plenty of food, water, rest, and protection from illness if possible. Something that may seem like a kindness at first. After all, feeding your prisoners before your sailors seems like a kindness bordering on madness, until you realize that people are a resource, and the prisoners were far more valuable than any loot from the cargo hold. Wealthier or well-connected prisoners could afford to have ransom paid for them. A few weeks at sea, a few weeks in a cell, and then freedom, leaving Princess Dido and Phoenicia wealthier. The prisoners who couldn't afford to pay ransom, however, people are a resource, and the most common use of that resource was slavery. Well-fed, healthy slaves were worth a lot more than starving, sickly skeletons. Whether they were sold to a bordello, a salt mine, a coliseum, or a wealthy villa of a wealthy aristo, the slaves being healthy made Princess Dido very wealthy and very well connected across the Central Sea. Every action, every thought, and every plan Dido had while at sea had a logical reason. Whether her actions were compassionate or cruel, she had her reasons, and she had her reasons every single time. When an enemy captain spat in her face, even though she cut out his tongue, she let him live, to sell him into slavery. When she captured a slave ship, she took the 80 prostitutes on board to her favorite port, to manage the port in her stead, and found the city that would become Kart Kadast. So, the privateer princess thrived by understanding what her enemies, and her victims, were thinking, and every action she took had a reason, and for most of her life, that is how the world worked. The dangers out there had thoughts, or reasons for being dangerous. So when she first found the ship graveyard in the western Central Sea, she was confounded by the new enemy she found. We weren't far from the pillars when we saw the first ship. It was drifting on the sea, crewless, with torches still burning despite the fact it was daytime. I boarded the ship with the men and saw evidence of a fight. The details of the fight weren't like any that I had seen before. The trails of blood and scratches led from the hold to the edges of the ship. There was flesh and blood, but no bodies. Usually battles that leave no survivors leave some bodies behind. We also noticed that the seabirds didn't want to touch the ship. Seabirds usually know that dead bodies and dead humans meant food, but they avoided the ship like it was plagued, or curse. The hold itself still had all of its weapons, saffron, and bolts of fabric, all untouched, like the fight wasn't over the loot, but something personal. I could see a table with dice, playing cards, and cups of wine. That seemed to be the start of the fighting. While men certainly start brawls and will kill each other over bets and wagers, these don't escalate into removing the entire crew, especially with all of the weapons still where they should be. The brawl could have only been with fists, feet, and knees. It also didn't help that the ship felt cold. The Central Sea is warm all year, but this ship was as cold as a grave. We took the bolts and had a few sailors pilot the ship to follow the fleet. The superstitious sailors said we should have left the ship behind, but the ship is too valuable for me to leave behind, especially since I can see strange storm clouds coming from the west. Storm clouds with red lightning. I left some men to guide the ship after the rest of the fleet to get closer to the storm. It was a very strange storm. Despite the red lightning and churning clouds above, the winds were pushing towards the storm, not away from it. No rain, hail, nor sleet fell. The storm felt far from natural. My crew whispered among themselves, which is strange, because by now my men know I don't care what they speak or think, only what they do. Still, with the strange storms, I spoke to my 2 husbands for their advice. Experienced leaders of men, but in 2 very different ways. Aeneas was a prince among his people. Not even the most well-loved prince when he had cousins named things like Overlord and Beautiful Man, while Aeneas's was named Grief by his mother. So the poorly loved prince of an insignificant city-state in Anatolia waited until that city-state fought some petty war with the Argivians as his chance to travel across the Central Sea. I know he explained the war several different times, but the story always felt like it was changing. Sometimes it was because of apples, sometimes it was because of a marriage between the queen and king, sometimes it was about revenge, and sometimes it was a war between his gods and the Argivian gods. What was clear about the war was Aeneas left it behind 10 years ago, and it was still going on. Still, he was an accomplished fighter, and he understood the Argivians and the Anatolians that we encountered, able to speak any language we needed, and he was a natural leader during a fight. However, he was unable to lead without a fight to guide him. When I proposed to him, I gave him a sword of Damascus steel, one of the best swords in my horde. He still fought with the sword all this time, killing at least 28 men with it, and enslaving far more by threatening with it. My other husband, Zykerbal, once was a priest king, before losing his city, Byblos, to the Comedians. How exactly he lost the city was quite an embarrassing story. A ship that was leaving his city was robbed, and the wronged man asked Zykerbal for compensation for the lost timber. Zykerbal said that since the city was robbed outside Byblos, he didn't have to pay for the lost cargo, but he would consider compensating the man if the man was willing to work for it. The man said he would think about it. He left Byblos and returned with an army. Zykerbal wasn't a strong fighter like Aeneas, but he was far shrewder in both politics and religion. Zykerbal hid his entire kingdom's treasury by burying it around the Central Sea, leaving the man who conquered his city with nothing, not even the people who evacuated Byblos for the ships. Zykerbal also understood the stories and gods of the Central Sea. Argivians, Celts, Phoenicians, Comedians, Numidians, and rumors was he even understood the beliefs of the distant Nubians, Achaemenids, Hebrews, and Scythians. But even though he understood all of those exotic temples and pantheons, he was a priest of Melkart, the builder of civilizations. Aeneas figured there would be opportunities in the storm. Ships sink in storms and sometimes wash ashore. There would be pillage and plunder, something that we could harvest before some Celtic clan snatched it all up. He figured that if the storm wasn't pushing us away, that it had to be dying out. Zykerbal also agreed we should push on into the storm, but for very different reasons. There is something unnatural out there, something that the gods do not want to exist in our world. Melkart watches over us with bated breath, but I do not know why. Maybe I will understand it when I get closer. I don't know if he is watching us holding an ankh or holding an axe, Zykerbal said as he clutched his axe tightly. I had seen him use the axe in ceremony many times, but he only raised the axe against the living in my defense. As we approached the storm, we realized it wasn't over some random place. It was over the capital city of Tartessos, an Argivian-ish kingdom as far west as civilization could be found. The only other things further west than them were Celts, Oceanus, and the sunset. We had been to Tartessos and the capital many times. A good place to sell, a good place to buy, and a good place to blackmail. A place as honorable as a snake's den, as warm as a sandpit, as profitable as a whorehouse, and as pious as an Adonis's cult ran by Tribates. But even so, it was still a physical place, somewhere that existed on Earth. When I saw what Tartessos was like under that storm, it looked like something from the underworld. From every underworld. We were close enough to the harbor that normally we could smell the city. Bread baking, meat cooking, the smells of life. The smells here are the smells of death. Not the smell of a battle, nor a pestilence, but something more than that. The smell of rot, burning flesh, and fear filled the air. The ships that were still tied to the docks had long brown streaks on their decks, with thousands of flies swarming the blood. The ships that were not tied to the docks were drifting, with one ship that was drifting close enough for us to view. The eyes of the boats were blotted out with blood that was still red and fresh. The sailors who were rowing the oars and walking the decks weren't living, but they were still moving. It's hard to explain how I know that they were dead. My men were more distracted by the city, but I could see the sailors. Even across the sea, I could see their skin was a deep, bloodless gray. Parts of their body were missing. Their clothes were tattered and in an ancient style that looked like something from the Museum of Ur. But there was something that I saw, but it wasn't like seeing with your eyes. It was like watching something fall. You can tell where it'll fall, even though it hasn't happened yet. Like how I could tell where my enemies were hiding at sea, or how I could tell what action they would take before they took it. A little whisper inside of my mind, guiding me, even if I didn't understand where it was coming from. I always thought it was just my own understanding, that everyone had a little voice inside of them, guiding them in what to do. In that moment, staring into the empty eyes and rotting tunics of the dead men, that voice wasn't whispering. That voice was screaming. And it was screaming the same thing to me over and over. The dead are still moving. The voice screamed as I watched the dead sailors, who watched us with utter boredom. We weren't worth considering in their eyes. We weren't interesting. We weren't threats, we weren't prey. But that didn't mean that the dead weren't angry at the living. On the sides of the ships, off the port and starboard sides, living people dangled into the ocean. Men, women, and children dangled together, their arms tied above their heads, their bodies stripped naked with only their heads and arms above the waterline, forced to hold their breaths any time the waves splashed against the sides of the ship. The people struggling to live beneath the sun, surf, and against the sides of the ship. A torture that lasts for too long for the living. Only when they were dead did the undead sailors pull them out of the water. New Marines for the dead, loyal to an unseen king. "Prepare a boarding party," I said, not quite believing the words that left my lips. Something inside of me, beneath all of the fear, didn't want to leave. The fear was telling me to run, but something deep inside of me, something that refused to be afraid, told me, if you don't stop them, they will spread everywhere. It said within me. I turned to my men, all of whom were too terrified to move, terrified of the dead and terrified of the city. Prepare a boarding party. We need the living. They will fetch high prices on the flesh market, I said, pointing towards the living tied to the ship. What I said was technically true, but I felt like the truth was too much for them to process. At least for now. My men began to move, but slower than I liked. At least until Zickerball spoke up. Listen to your captain. Melkart has spoken. Prepare, for she speaks for Tanit, he yelled as they finally strapped on their weapons and armor as the ship pulled alongside the dead ship. I was the first to step onto the dead ship, and I could feel a chill from the boards, as cold as a corpse's touch as I strode towards the dead captain. The sailors and marines I passed by didn't even glance our way. They stepped out of our way and moved to avoid us, but otherwise they may as well have been blind to us. The dead didn't speak, they didn't breathe, and their bodies were free of any living movement. It's hard to explain if you haven't seen it. A living thing twitches, it breathes, it itches, it scratches, it relaxes, it tightens. Dozens or hundreds of little movements, even while sleeping. The dead's movements were so still, only moving with purpose, for a reason, and even those movements were direct, efficient, and with minimal energy, moving without care about how the body felt, only to get the action done, leaving scraps of flesh and congealed blood behind while they moved, uncaring about what they left behind. Perfect soldiers, perfect slaves, perfect enemies. The captain of the ship was not like the others. Behind his singular remaining eye, I could see recognition behind his remaining eye. The empty socket glowed with the same red of the lightning above us. The eye that looked at me stared into my soul. I could see that the dead man had no soul, but he still had recognition. I didn't know it was possible to have recognition without soul, but I could see it. It was the same feeling when a shark decides that what it was looking at was going to be its meal. Know thyself, nothing to excess. Certainty brings ruin, the captain whispered when he saw my face. I pulled out my sword, pointing the blade to the dead man's liver. He did not so much as twitch as he repeated what he said with greater and greater urgency. Know thyself, nothing to excess. Certainty brings ruin. Know thyself, nothing to excess. Certainty brings ruin. Know thyself, nothing to excess. Certainty brings ruin, he repeated again and again, as I finally ran my blade through his liver, leaving behind yellow and black bile as his humors splashed onto the deck of his ship. With my sword still inside of him, he kept repeating his cursed statements. Know thyself, nothing to excess. Certainty brings ruin, he repeated as I brought my sword up through his body, severing spine, ribs, sternum, neck, and skull, with about as much difficulty as slicing bread. But as his brains were finally slipped out of his skull, did he finally stop speaking as he fell to the ground, not even a gurgle escaping the shattered remains of his body. The captain's sailors and marines did not respond to his fall, but now knowing that these dead men could be destroyed, I ordered to my party, Smash their skulls, split their heads, remove the brains from their skulls. Let the curse leak out with them, I told them as the men obeyed. We brought the survivors onto our ship and left living crew in charge of the dead man's ship, sprinkling salt along the decks to clean the brains and to purify the deck. Salt is as precious as gold. The ships are more precious than the gold to clean it. But as the salt all was pushed across the ship stopped feeling so cold. As we removed the dead men's humors, the ship began to feel alive again. When we removed the blood from the painted eyes of the ships, it felt free from the curse. And when we finally replaced the tattered banner of Tartessos with the banner of Tanit, the symbol of my fleet, the symbol of me, did the ship feel like mine and not a monument to decay? I ordered the men to sleep while at anchor. The sun was too low to allow us to fight. And in my dreams, I could hear the dead man's voice as I saw my vision. I saw the Central Sea rising, sinking the cities, beaches, and farms of civilization. I saw desperate ships trying to stay afloat, the dead crawling from the sea onto the ships, weighing them down more and more, ripping the ships apart board by board, piece by piece, until only piles of boards and canvas remained. The dead still kept rising from the rising sea, tearing down those boards and floating canvas, sinking it all beneath the waves, eventually leaving nothing left on the surface of the sea. Still, I could still see the seas rising, eclipsing the clouds, sun, moon, and stars, leaving only darkness, sea, and the countless eyes and mouths of the dead. When I awoke, I told my men, "Tell all of the ships. I tell them to vote for a representative among their number. A captain, a marine, a slave, a whore, I care not. But everybody who can bear arms will vote for one to speak for their ship. And at noon we will assemble on my ship, and we will discuss, and we will vote like the Laconians and the Delians. Do we attack Tartessos, or do we leave them to their fate? All will get a chance to speak, and all will get a chance to vote."